Were medieval sieges really just about armored knights and damsels in distress? Did women simply cower in towers waiting for rescue from the 6th to the 15th century? What if what you thought you knew about women and war was just a cleverly spun tale? Number 10. The myth of the universally weeping lady during siege. The enduring image in tales and pictures often shows noblewomen, pale and trembling, wiping away tears as their castles face overwhelming odds. This portrayal suggests a default state of emotional fragility and helplessness for women trapped within beleaguered walls. It paints a picture of constant despair, an inability to cope with the brutal realities of a medieval siege. This perspective rarely highlights any other emotional response or practical contribution. The narrative usually centers on their vulnerability, making their primary role one of suffering and being a symbol of what the men were fighting to protect. It frames their existence in wartime as purely passive and reactive, defined by distress. But history reveals a much richer and more varied emotional landscape for women facing siege. Many accounts detail women displaying immense courage, fierce defiance, and strategic resilience. Their actions often contradicted the stereotype of the delicate weeping lady. These women were not just spectators to their fate, they were active participants in the emotional and physical struggle for survival. Their responses ranged from desperate bravery to shrewd negotiation, far beyond the confines of simple lamentation. They understood the stakes, and their reactions were often deeply practical, not just emotional. They faced the same privations, the same danger, and often rose to meet the challenges with a strength that belied common historical portrayals. Take, for instance, Agnes Randolph, known to history as Black Agnes, the Countess of Dunbar. In 1338, during the Second War of Scottish Independence, her husband was away, leaving her in charge of Dunbar Castle. The English forces, led by the Earl of Salisbury, laid a heavy siege. Agnes was not weeping. Instead, she became a legend of defiant resistance. When a massive trebuchet called the Wolf hurled giant stones at the castle walls, she had her women attendants dust off the battlements with their aprons, mocking the attackers' efforts. When Salisbury captured her younger brother and threatened to hang him in front of the castle unless she surrendered, Agnes reputedly shouted that she was not concerned, for she had his old nurse and a better heir safe inside. This was not the behavior of a weeping woman, it was the sharp wit and steel nerve of a commander. She personally oversaw the castle's defenses, encouraging the garrison, directing operations, and maintaining morale throughout the 5-month siege. Her actions were recorded by chroniclers like Andrew of Wintoun, who highlighted her boldness and determination. Her resilience became a rallying cry for the Scots. The siege eventually failed, a testament to her unyielding spirit. Another compelling example is Jeanne de Montfort, a noblewoman who proved her mettle during the Breton War of Succession in the mid-14th century. When her husband, John IV, Duke of Brittany, was captured by the French in 1342, Jeanne did not succumb to grief or despair. Instead, she put on armor, mounted her horse, and rallied her husband's supporters. She rode through towns and castles, inspiring troops and citizens to continue the fight. Her most famous stand came during the siege of Hennebont by French and Breton forces loyal to Charles of Blois. While besieged, Jeanne led a sortie from the castle walls. She rode out with 300 men, set fire to the enemy's camp and siege engines, and then, finding her path back to the castle blocked, rode 20 miles to Brest, gathered more troops, and returned to relieve Hennebont. This daring feat of military leadership and personal bravery stands in stark contrast to the image of a helpless woman. The chroniclers like Jean Froissart documented her incredible courage, highlighting her presence on the battlements and her active participation in the defense. Her actions were not those of a victim, but a fierce warrior queen. Even among women of lower social standing, accounts defy the weeping lady stereotype. During the siege of Beauvais in 1472, when Charles the Bold of Burgundy attacked the city, the women of Beauvais played a crucial role in its defense. One ordinary woman, Jeanne Hachette, became a local heroine. When Burgundian soldiers scaled the walls and planted their banner, Jeanne, armed with a small axe, single-handedly drove them back, tearing down their banner and inspiring the other townspeople, including many women, to repel the assault. This act of spontaneous bravery ignited a wider resistance among the women. They carried ammunition, tended to the wounded, repaired defenses, and actively participated in the fight, throwing stones, hot oil, and anything else they could find upon the attackers. Their collective determination and defiance were essential to the city's successful defense. The city later honored their contribution, granting women special privileges in parades, a clear recognition of their active, unweeping role. Their actions were recorded in local chronicles and later by historians like Philippe de Comines, showcasing their resilience rather than mere lamentation. These historical accounts demonstrate that the emotional responses of women during medieval sieges were as varied and complex as those of men. While fear and sorrow were undoubtedly present, so too were defiance, strategic thinking, courage, and a fierce determination to protect their homes and families. The portrayal of the universally weeping lady often served a narrative purpose, perhaps to heighten the heroism of the male defenders, or to fit into a pre-existing social ideal of feminine vulnerability. However, the evidence from historical records and chronicles paints a picture of women who often met the horrors of siege warfare with remarkable strength and an unwavering resolve. They were not merely passive figures of distress, they were active agents in the defense of their homes and lives, their tears, if any, often overshadowed by their unyielding spirit. Number 9. The notion of women being exclusively confined to domestic roles during siege. A common misconception suggests that during medieval sieges, women were strictly relegated to traditional domestic duties within the confines of the castle or town walls. This view often limits their activities to cooking, cleaning, child rearing, and perhaps tending to the wounded, all behind the scenes and away from the direct action of defense. It implies a clear division of labor, where men fought and women maintained the household, even under the most extreme conditions. This perspective ignores any active or direct participation women might have had in the defense or management of the besieged community, reducing their roles to solely supportive, non-combative functions. It places them far from the strategic or physical demands of a siege, presenting them as an almost separate entity from the direct military effort. However, historical records provide ample evidence that women's roles during sieges expanded dramatically beyond purely domestic tasks, often encompassing vital logistical, administrative, and even direct defensive responsibilities. The desperate circumstances of a siege demanded that every able-bodied person contribute in whatever way they could to ensure survival. This often meant that traditional gender roles were blurred or temporarily set aside, as women stepped into roles that were typically considered male prerogatives. Their contributions were often crucial for the survival of the besieged community, ranging from managing resources to active participation in maintaining the defenses. Consider the pragmatic realities of a long siege. Someone had to manage the dwindling food supplies, ensuring they were distributed fairly and stretched as far as possible. This was often the responsibility of the chatelaine or mistress of the household, a woman who often already managed the estate in peacetime. She would be responsible for rationing, overseeing the storage of provisions, and making difficult decisions about who received what. This administrative role was far from simple domesticity. It was a critical logistical task, directly impacting the garrison's ability to fight and survive. For instance, in many sieges, noblewomen were recorded as overseeing the distribution of food and water, ensuring the sick and injured were cared for, and maintaining sanitary conditions, all crucial for preventing disease, which was often as deadly as enemy attack. These tasks required significant organizational skills and authority. Beyond logistics, women were also integral to the maintenance and repair of defenses. When walls were breached or damaged by siege engines, repairs were immediate and constant. Women, alongside men, would carry stones, mortar, and timber to the damaged sections. They would haul water, prepare heated liquids, and projectiles to be thrown down on attackers, and often assist in the construction of temporary barricades. For chroniclers like Jean Froissart sometimes mentioned women carrying stones and other materials to the battlements, demonstrating their direct physical involvement in the defensive efforts. Their labor was essential to keep the fortifications intact and the garrison protected. Furthermore, women often held key administrative roles in the absence of their husbands or male relatives. If a lord was away fighting or captured, his wife or mother often became the de facto commander of the castle or town. This was not a domestic role, but a position of military and administrative authority. They would oversee the garrison, make strategic decisions, negotiate with the enemy, and manage the defense. Blanche of Castile, regent of France, successfully defended the realm and its castles during the Albigensian Crusade and against rebellious barons in the 13th century. Her political and military leadership, involving overseeing defensive strategies and diplomatic efforts, was anything but domestic. She ensured the security of her son, Louis IX, and the kingdom, demonstrating profound administrative capacity under pressure. During the famous Siege of La Rochelle in 1372, towards the end of the Hundred Years' War, the women of the city played a significant and documented role. While men fought on the walls, women were not merely cooking inside. They were vital in maintaining the morale of the defenders, caring for the wounded, and even participating in the collection and preparation of ammunition. They carried hot water and pitch to the battlements, ready to be poured on the attackers. Their collective effort extended far beyond their homes, encompassing civic duties essential for the city's survival. Their activities highlight how a siege often transformed civilian life, demanding a collective response where gendered roles became secondary to the immediate needs of defense. These examples clearly illustrate that women's roles during medieval sieges extended far beyond the confines of purely domestic duties. They were managers of resources, contributors to physical labor, caretakers, and, in many cases, active leaders and strategists. The desperate circumstances of a siege demanded the full engagement of all members of the community, and women rose to these challenges, proving their indispensability in maintaining the resistance and ensuring survival. Their contributions, often overlooked, were foundational to the defense efforts, demonstrating a resilience and adaptability that defies the narrow domestic stereotype. Number 8, the assumption that noblewomen were entirely sheltered from siege realities. There is a prevalent idea that noblewomen, due to their privileged status, were somehow insulated from the harsh realities of a medieval siege. This perspective imagines them living in relative comfort within the castle keep, untouched by the privations, dangers, and fear that gripped the common soldiers and peasants. It suggests that their social standing provided a shield, allowing them to avoid the direct impacts of starvation, disease, and enemy attack. This image portrays them as delicate figures, often whisked away to safety or existing in a separate, more refined sphere far removed from the dirt and brutality of the siege lines. It implies their primary experience of a siege was one of waiting, protected by their status as male defenders. However, historical accounts thoroughly contradict this notion. Noblewomen, perhaps even more than common women, were intimately exposed to the full spectrum of siege realities, often bearing unique burdens. Their elevated status did not shield them from the deprivations or dangers. In many cases, it placed them at the very heart of the conflict. A castle was not just a military stronghold, but also a home, and when it was besieged, its inhabitants, noble or common, shared a common fate. Noblewomen faced the same dwindling food and water supplies, the same spread of disease, and the same terrifying prospect of a breach or capture. Their roles were often critical, and their personal safety was always at stake. Many noblewomen were often the targets of an enemy's strategy. Their capture could yield a significant ransom, a valuable hostage, or a strategic marriage. Thus, they were not just passive residents, but prized assets or potential victims. This meant they were directly imperiled by the siege. For example, during the siege of Vannes in 1342, Jeanne de Clisson, a noblewoman, suffered the direct consequences of war when her husband, Olivier IV de Clisson, was captured and later executed by the French king. Her fury led her to become the notorious Lioness of Brittany, turning to piracy against French ships. While her subsequent actions were at sea, her initial tragedy stemmed directly from the brutal realities of a siege and its aftermath, showing no insulation for her noble status. Beyond being targets, noblewomen frequently took active command when their husbands were absent or killed. Their political and administrative skills, honed in managing large estates, were directly applied to siege defense. They oversaw provisions, managed the garrison, and sometimes even negotiated with the enemy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, though not directly defending a castle, experienced firsthand the political instability and dangers of war, including threats to her domains and herself throughout her long life. Her involvement in rebellions and her numerous journeys exposed her to risks that belied any notion of a sheltered existence based on her royal status. Her influence meant she was always in the thick of political and military machinations, often targeted or imprisoned. The stark example is that of Catherine Sforza, a formidable countess during the late 15th century bordering late medieval and early Renaissance. When her fortress of Forli was besieged in 1488, she defied papal forces. Legend says when her enemies threatened to kill her children if she did not surrender, she famously stood on the battlements, lifted her skirts, and declared she had the means to make more, demonstrating absolute defiance. While this tale might be embellished, it perfectly encapsulates her legendary refusal to yield, her personal bravery, and her direct exposure to the siege. She was at the forefront of the defense, organizing resistance, and directly confronting the enemy. Her personal safety was paramount, yet she put herself in extreme peril, a stark contrast to being sheltered. Even more common noblewomen, like the Castellan's wife, lived within the very walls that faced battering rams and trebuchets. Their chambers, kitchens, and chapels were part of the military target. They endured the same hunger and thirst when supplies ran low, the same fear of disease, and the same constant noise and danger of bombardment. Their children were with them, sharing the same fate. They often walked the battlements, encouraged the men, and were intimately involved in the desperate struggle for survival. Their social standing did not provide a magical barrier against a collapsing wall or a disease-ridden well. The idea that noble women were sheltered from siege realities is a romanticized distortion. In truth, their elevated position often placed them in more direct peril and gave them greater responsibility during such crises. They were not removed from the struggle, but were often central figures, bearing the brunt of the siege alongside everyone else. Their experiences underscore the harsh, indiscriminate nature of medieval warfare, where status offered little protection against the realities of a determined besieger. Number 7. The idea that women never engaged in direct combat during sieges. A widespread historical distortion posits that women in medieval sieges were strictly non-combatants, never taking up arms or participating directly in the fighting. This view often limits their contributions to supportive roles, like tending the wounded or providing provisions, while presenting actual combat as an exclusively male domain. It reinforces the image of women as inherently unsuited for violence and warfare, suggesting they were always protected from the direct action of battle, even when their lives were at stake. This perspective ignores any instances of female martial prowess or necessity-driven combat, reducing their role to one of passive spectatorship when a breach occurred. However, historical records, though not as numerous as those for male combatants, clearly show instances of women directly engaging in combat during sieges. While it might have been an exceptional occurrence rather than a common practice, these accounts demonstrate that women were capable and willing to fight when their homes, families, and lives were on the line. The desperate circumstances of a siege often blurred traditional gender roles, forcing every available person to contribute to the defense, even if it meant taking up arms. These women often fought out of necessity, courage, or an overwhelming desire to protect their community. One of the most celebrated examples comes from the Siege of Beauvais in 1472, mentioned earlier. Here, a common woman named Jeanne Hachette, real name Jeanne Laisnay, became a symbol of female resistance. When the Burgundian army attacked, led by Charles the Bold, a group of his soldiers managed to scale the city walls and plant their banner. It was at this critical moment that Jeanne Hachette, armed with a small axe hachette, confronted the banner-bearer, striking him down and tearing down his standard. Her courageous act rallied the fleeing male defenders and inspired other women of Beauvais to join the fray. These women began throwing stones, boiling water, and other projectiles from the walls onto the attackers. They were actively engaged in repelling the assault, not merely observing. The city's successful defense was partially credited to the women's direct involvement in combat, a fact commemorated by an annual procession in Beauvais for centuries. Another notable account comes from the siege of Castelnuovo in 1382. When the city was attacked by the Venetians, the chronicler Giacomo di Lentini recorded that the women of the city, inspired by the dire situation, armed themselves and fought alongside the men on the walls. They reportedly threw rocks, spears, and whatever else they could find at the besiegers. While specifics of their individual actions are scarce, the chronicler's mention indicates that their participation was significant enough to warrant historical notice, highlighting a direct combat role. During the Hundred Years' War, particularly in prolonged sieges, chronicles occasionally mention women participating in the defense of walls. For example, during the Siege of Caux in 1380, when the English garrison was under siege by the French, women were recorded as assisting in the defense by carrying materials, but also by throwing stones and pouring hot liquids onto the attackers from the ramparts. This direct action of engaging the enemy, even if with non-traditional weapons, constitutes active combat within the context of a siege. They were not just passive targets, they were active participants in the physical fight for survival. Even mythical or semi-legendary figures, while perhaps exaggerated, reflect a cultural understanding that women could fight. The Amazons of ancient Greek mythology, though not medieval, influenced medieval perceptions of powerful women. More directly, figures like Matilda of Canossa, a powerful countess in 11th century Italy, led her own armies and personally directed military campaigns and defenses of her castles. While her primary role was command, her presence and authority over her troops and her direct involvement in warfare blurred the lines between commander and combatant in the eyes of her contemporaries. Though not wielding a sword in every battle, her active military role defied the passive female stereotype. It is crucial to understand that direct, hand-to-hand combat on a medieval battlefield was rare for most men, let alone women. But within the confined and desperate environment of a siege, the rules often changed. When a breach occurred, or an enemy scaled the walls, every person became a potential defender. The accounts, while perhaps not universal, definitively show that women were not always confined to passive roles, but sometimes fought fiercely, wielding weapons, and directly confronting the enemy to protect their homes and lives. Their participation in direct combat, born out of necessity and courage, challenges the persistent myth of their complete non-involvement in the physical struggle. Number 6, the fallacy that women were merely present to be rescued by knights. One of the most persistent and romanticized distortions about women in medieval sieges is the notion that their primary purpose for being present was to serve as damsels in distress, waiting passively to be rescued by valiant knights. This narrative often casts women as helpless figures, the ultimate prize or motivation for male heroism. It suggests that their presence in a besieged castle was solely to highlight the bravery and chivalry of the male defenders, framing them as objects of protection rather than active agents in their own survival. This perspective reduces women to symbolic tokens, entirely dependent on male intervention for their fate. However, historical records paint a far more complex and active picture of women's roles during sieges, often showing them as agents of their own rescue, as negotiators, or even as the ones leading the defense and holding out long after male defenders might have surrendered. The idea of a passive damsel waiting for rescue is largely a product of later romantic literature and popular culture, not a consistent reality of medieval warfare. The harsh pragmatism of a siege often demanded that everyone contribute to survival, regardless of gender, and many women rose to the occasion with remarkable agency. Consider, again, Agnes Randolph, the Countess of Dunbar, during the 1338 siege by the English. She was not waiting for rescue, she was the one holding out the castle. Her husband was away, and she personally commanded the defense for 5 months. She mocked the besiegers, repelled assaults, and refused all demands for surrender. Her defiance, not her rescue, secured the castle. The English eventually gave up, unable to break her will or the castle's defenses. This was a noblewoman who engineered her own, and her castle's survival, completely subverting the passive damsel trope. Her strength was the shield, not a knight's. Jean de Montfort, during the Breton War of Succession in the 1340s, offers another powerful counterexample. When her husband was captured, she donned armor and rallied her supporters. During the siege of Hennebont, she did not wait for a knight to rescue her. Instead, she led a sortie, burned the enemy's camp, and then rode through enemy territory to gather reinforcements. Her actions were bold, strategic, and self-directed. She was the rescuer, not the rescued. Jean Froissart, a contemporary chronicler, described her as having the courage of a man and the heart of a lion, highlighting her active role and leadership. Even in cases where outside relief did arrive, the steadfastness of the women inside often played a crucial role in enabling that relief. The resilience of the besieged, often bolstered by the determination of women, prevented an early surrender, thereby giving a relief force time to arrive. Their unwavering spirit was a key factor in keeping the siege going long enough for help to materialize. They weren't just passively holding on, they were actively contributing to the psychological and physical endurance that allowed for a potential rescue. Furthermore, many women were involved in negotiations during sieges, a role that required sharp intellect, diplomatic skill, and agency. Whether negotiating terms of surrender, safe passage, or truce, noblewomen often acted as intermediaries or direct participants in talks. Their ability to negotiate often determined the fate of the besieged population, including their own. This was a powerful and active role, far removed from being a mere passive object of rescue. For example, chronicles sometimes mention noblewomen being sent out to negotiate terms of surrender or to plead for mercy for the besieged, demonstrating their direct involvement in critical decision-making. The idea of women as solely objects of rescue during medieval sieges is a romanticized oversimplification. In the harsh realities of warfare, women, whether noble or common, were often active agents in their own survival and the defense of their communities. They led, they fought, they endured, and they negotiated, often demonstrating a resilience and strategic acumen that directly challenged the passive damsel narrative. Their experiences reveal that courage and determination were not exclusive to any gender, and that survival in a siege often depended on the collective, active efforts of everyone involved, not just the heroism of a lone knight. At number 5, the distortion that women had no agency or contribution in sieges if they were not noble. A persistent historical distortion suggests that if a woman was not of noble birth, she had virtually no agency or significant contribution during a medieval siege. This perspective often limits the roles of peasant women or common townswomen to that of passive victims, cannon fodder, or merely part of the background population. It implies that only noble women, with their connections and political power, could influence the course of events, while the vast majority of women were without voice, power, or any meaningful role in the desperate struggle for survival. This view dismisses the critical contributions of ordinary women, rendering their experiences invisible and their actions insignificant. However, historical records and the pragmatic realities of medieval sieges demonstrate that women of all social classes played essential and often decisive roles. While their contributions might not have been recorded in the same grand chronicles as those of queens or countesses, their collective labor, resilience, and occasional acts of defiance were fundamental to the survival and defense of any besieged community. The sheer number of non-noble women meant their collective actions had a massive impact, far from being insignificant. A siege was a total war for those inside the walls, requiring the participation of everyone, regardless of social standing. Peasant women, for example, were vital for pre-siege provisioning. Before a siege began, it was often women who worked the fields, harvested crops, and raised livestock that would feed the besieged population. Their labor in food production was crucial for building up the stores that would sustain the castle or town during a long blockade. When the siege began, they would often be forced to abandon their homes in the surrounding countryside and seek refuge within the fortified walls, bringing with them whatever meager supplies they could. This influx of population added mouths to feed, but also hands to work. Once inside the walls, ordinary women performed a multitude of critical tasks. They were essential for maintaining sanitation, which was a constant battle against disease in cramped, besieged conditions. They fetched water, often from wells that could be targeted by enemy archers, risking their lives with each trip. They cooked and prepared meals from dwindling provisions, making sure that what little food was available was stretched as far as possible. They cared for the wounded, often without proper medical supplies, acting as nurses and healers. Their resilience in these tasks was vital for maintaining public health and morale. Furthermore, common women often participated directly in the physical defense of the fortifications. As mentioned before, during the Siege of Beauvais in 1472, the actions of Jeanne Hachette, a non-noble woman, sparked a widespread participation of other ordinary women in the defense. They helped repair damaged walls, carried stones, threw hot oil and other projectiles onto attackers. Their collective efforts in repelling assaults were crucial. Chroniclers might not have named every individual woman, but their collective impact was undeniable. They demonstrated that the courage and determination to defend one's home were not limited by social status. The everyday labor of common women also extended to tasks like forging and mending, contributing to the upkeep of equipment or even improvised weaponry. They might have helped prepare gunpowder, fashion arrows, or repair clothing for the soldiers. Their ability to contribute to the logistical chain, however humble, was indispensable. Even in desperate times, women, regardless of their social standing, could exert moral and social influence. Their determination to endure, their pleas for help, or their very presence could inspire defenders or weigh on the consciences of besiegers. While not political agency, in the noble sense, this form of social agency was a real force within the besieged community. Their willingness to suffer alongside the men, to share in the privations and dangers, created a bond that bolstered collective resistance. The notion that non-noble women had no agency or significant contribution during medieval sieges is a profound oversight. Their labor, resilience, and occasional acts of direct involvement were foundational to the survival and defense of any besieged community. They cooked, cleaned, nursed, repaired, and sometimes fought, all out of necessity and a deep commitment to their homes and families. Their experiences, though less often singled out in grand historical narratives, formed the bedrock of resistance during these brutal periods, proving that courage and contribution knew no social boundaries. Number 4. The misconception that women were always raped or taken as spoils of war. A dark and pervasive historical distortion regarding medieval sieges is the generalization that women captured during these events were inevitably subjected to rape or immediately taken as spoils of war, becoming property or slaves of the victors. This narrative often implies a universal outcome, a complete loss of agency and dignity for any woman caught in a besieged settlement that fell to the enemy. It paints a picture of inevitable sexual violence and dehumanization as the primary fate of all women after a siege, reinforcing a bleak and absolute outcome. This view simplifies a complex reality and overlooks other potential fates, and the varying degrees of control women could exert even in dire circumstances. While it is an undeniable and tragic truth that rape and sexual violence were indeed horrific realities of medieval warfare and sieges, and women were often treated as spoils of war, particularly common women, it is a distortion to suggest this was the only or universal outcome for all women. The realities were far more varied, influenced by factors such as the woman's social status, the specific customs or orders of the attacking army, the political objectives of the siege, and even individual acts of resistance or negotiation. Different fates existed, from ransom and arranged marriages to limited protection or even escape. For noblewomen, their fate was often tied to political objectives. While sexual violence was a risk, their high value as hostages or potential marital alliances often provided a different, albeit still precarious, path. A captured noblewoman could be ransomed for a substantial sum, providing significant wealth to the victorious lord. Her family would spare no expense to secure her return. Eleanor of Brittany, for example, cousin of King Arthur I of Brittany, was captured multiple times but primarily held for political leverage and ransom, not as a sexual prize. Her value lay in her lineage. Even more commonly, captured noblewomen might be forced into strategic marriages. Such unions could solidify alliances, absorb conquered territories, or legitimize new rulers. While these were not marriages of choice and often involved significant trauma, they were a political outcome distinct from immediate sexual violence or enslavement. The historical record includes numerous instances of noblewomen whose fates were determined by political unions after capture or military defeat. For instance, the daughter of a defeated lord might be married off to a victorious commander, serving as a political bond. For common women, the situation was indeed far more perilous, and the risk of violence and enslavement was significantly higher. They lacked the ransom value or political leverage of noblewomen. However, even for them, absolute universality of sexual violence was not always the case. Some women might be killed, others forced into servitude, and some might even be allowed to flee if they were deemed insignificant, or if the victors did not have the resources to manage a large captive population. There are also instances where specific commanders might issue orders attempting to prevent indiscriminate slaughter or rape, sometimes for practical reasons, e.g., maintaining order, reputation, or for future taxation purposes, or sometimes for moral ones, though these orders were frequently ignored in the chaos of a sacked city. The very chronicles that sometimes describe the horrors of sacking also occasionally detail instances where women were spared due to a specific plea, a negotiation, or the intervention of a particular knight or commander. While rare, these accounts show that the outcome was not always predetermined. The spoils of war label often referred to movable property and people, including women, who could be taken and sold. This was a brutal reality. However, the exact fate of women as spoils varied from forced labor to prostitution to concubinage, and sometimes, if they were lucky, merely displacement. The emphasis on universal rape often overshadows these other, equally grim but distinct, outcomes. It is crucial to acknowledge the pervasive threat of sexual violence and the dehumanizing treatment of women in medieval sieges without presenting it as an absolute, uniform, and inevitable fate for every woman. The reality, while undeniably grim for most, was a complex tapestry of varying outcomes influenced by social status, political objectives, and the specific circumstances of each siege. To generalize the worst possible outcome as the only outcome for all women is a historical distortion that obscures the nuanced and often brutal realities of medieval warfare, and the sometimes surprising ways in which women survived or even resisted their capture. Number 3, the myth of complete female passivity in siege logistics and defense. A common historical distortion suggests that women in medieval sieges were entirely passive in terms of logistics and defense, acting merely as recipients of protection rather than active contributors to the very mechanisms that kept the siege going. This view often portrays men as solely responsible for all strategic planning, resource management, and physical labor related to defense, while women are seen as simply being inside the castle, benefiting from the men's efforts without contributing to the complex machinery of siege survival. It implies a complete lack of female agency in the practical, day-to-day operations that were critical during a sustained siege. However, historical records vividly contradict this myth, revealing that women were deeply and indispensably involved in the logistical backbone and direct defense of besieged communities. Their participation ranged from mundane but vital tasks to significant administrative and even physical contributions, proving their agency and active role in sustaining resistance. The extreme pressure of a siege often dissolved rigid gender roles, compelling everyone to contribute to survival. Consider the daily struggle for provisions. As already touched upon, noblewomen chatelaines were often in charge of the castle's stores even in peacetime. During a siege, this role became immensely critical. They would be responsible for rationing food and water, ensuring fair distribution among the entire population, including the garrison, civilians, and children. This involved meticulous accounting, difficult decisions about who received what, and the careful management of dwindling resources. This was not a passive role, but an active, high-stakes administrative duty vital for preventing starvation and maintaining order. The ability to stretch meager supplies for months could mean the difference between surrender and holding out for relief. Beyond food, women were crucial for managing other vital resources. They collected and conserved fuel, often risking their lives to gather wood from outside the walls before a complete blockade. They managed the limited medical supplies, tending to the wounded and sick, a constant drain on resources, and a battle against infection. They also played a critical role in sanitation, preventing outbreaks of disease which were often more deadly than enemy weapons. These logistical tasks required significant organizational skill, physical labor, and unwavering dedication. In terms of defense, women were not merely passive onlookers. They actively participated in the physical maintenance and repair of fortifications. When siege engines battered walls or mines created breaches, women would carry stones, buckets of water, and other materials to the breach points, working alongside men to repair the damage under fire. And they hauled buckets of hot oil, pitch, or even human waste to the battlements, ready to be poured on attackers attempting to scale the walls. This direct physical contribution to the defense, though often unglamorous, was absolutely vital. For example, during the Siege of Carlisle in 1315 by Robert the Bruce, the chronicles mention the entire population, including women and children, engaged in defending the walls. They carried stones, timber, and other materials to reinforce weak points, demonstrating a collective effort in which women's labor was explicitly noted as integral to the defense. Their contribution was not merely symbolic. It was practical and physically demanding. Furthermore, women often played a psychological and morale-boosting role, which, while not physical logistics, was a crucial part of defense. They encouraged the defenders, tended to their emotional well-being, and maintained a semblance of normal life amidst the chaos, which was important for preventing despair. Their resilience and steadfastness often bolstered the resolve of the fighting men. The idea that women were entirely passive in siege logistics and defense is a profound underestimation of their contributions. From managing precious food stores and maintaining hygiene to carrying building materials and preparing defensive projectiles, women were deeply embedded in the practical realities of siege survival. Their active participation, often born out of necessity and a fierce desire to protect their homes and families, was a fundamental part of the defensive effort, challenging any notion of their complete passivity. Number 2, the underestimation of women's strategic and leadership roles in sieges. A significant historical distortion often portrays women in medieval sieges as devoid of strategic thought or leadership capability, implying that such roles were exclusively reserved for men, typically the male lord or a military commander. This perspective suggests that women were either incapable of understanding military tactics or were simply never given the authority to make critical decisions during a siege. It paints a picture where women, even noblewomen, merely existed within the castle walls, their fate decided by the strategic acumen of the men around them, without any input or direct influence. This view disregards the numerous instances where women, by necessity or design, stepped into commanding positions and demonstrated remarkable strategic prowess. However, historical records contain compelling examples of women not only participating in the defense, but actively leading it, making critical strategic decisions and demonstrating sophisticated understanding of military and political dynamics. The absence of a male lord often created a power vacuum that strong, capable women were compelled or chose to fill. These women were not just figureheads, they actively directed defenses, managed garrisons, and engaged in high-stakes negotiations, challenging the stereotype of their strategic ineptitude. One of the most prominent examples is Matilda of Canossa, a powerful ruler in 11th century Italy. She was not just a noblewoman residing in a castle, she commanded armies, personally directed military campaigns, and was deeply involved in the complex political and military struggles of her time, including numerous sieges of her own castles. She was a shrewd politician and a capable military leader, often facing down emperors and popes. Her ability to defend her vast territories and strategic fortresses demonstrated profound strategic insight, logistical mastery, and unwavering leadership. Her contemporaries acknowledged her military prowess, a stark contrast to the idea of women being outside the sphere of strategy. Another powerful illustration is Blanche of Castile, Queen Regent of France in the 13th century. When her son Louis IX was a minor, Blanche effectively ruled the kingdom. She faced rebellious barons and even a papal crusade against her in southern France. She personally oversaw military campaigns, directed the defense of key castles and towns, and managed the diplomatic and military resources of France. Her strategic decisions, including the deployment of troops and the reinforcement of fortifications, were instrumental in consolidating royal power and defending the realm. Chronicles of her time, like those of Matthew Paris, speak of her formidable will and political astuteness, clearly outlining her leadership in military affairs, not just domestic governance. She successfully put down revolts that threatened the very existence of the French monarchy, actions requiring immense strategic capability. Jeanne de Montfort, during the Breton War of Succession in the 14th century, exemplified strategic leadership under duress. After her husband's capture, she took up arms and rallied her cause. At the Siege of Hennebont, she did not just passively resist, she initiated strategic maneuvers. Her famous sortie to burn the besiegers' camp was a proactive military decision designed to disrupt the enemy and gain an advantage. Her subsequent ride to Brest to gather reinforcements was a calculated strategic move to break the siege. Her leadership was not just about inspiring troops, it was about executing concrete military tactics that turned the tide of the conflict. These examples and others reveal that noblewomen were often educated in the management of large estates, which included understanding topography, resource management, and the loyalty of vassals, all skills transferable to military strategy. Their ability to manage large households and landholdings in peacetime often provided them with the necessary administrative and decision-making experience to lead in wartime. When a lord was away, his wife often became the military and political head of the household, a role that demanded significant strategic thought and leadership. The underestimation of women's strategic and leadership roles in sieges is a significant historical distortion. It ignores the numerous instances where women, both out of necessity and inherent capability, stepped into commanding positions, demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking, and successfully led defenses against formidable foes. These women were not mere passive inhabitants, but active commanders, whose decisions and leadership often determined the fate of their besieged communities, challenging the notion that strategic thinking was solely a male domain. Number 1. The blanket assertion that chivalry always protected women during sieges. Perhaps one of the most ingrained and romanticized historical distortions is the blanket assertion that the code of chivalry consistently and universally protected women during medieval sieges. This idealized view suggests that knights and soldiers, guided by chivalric ideals, would always spare women from harm, violence, and the worst brutalities of war. It implies a moral constraint that transcended the chaos and brutality of siege warfare, painting a picture where women were invariably treated with respect and offered special consideration due to their gender. This perception is heavily influenced by later Romantic literature and often overshadows the grim realities of medieval conflict. However, historical records overwhelmingly demonstrate that while chivalry was an ideal, it was often honored in the breach, especially during the desperate and brutal realities of a siege. The conduct of warfare was frequently driven by pragmatism, vengeance, and the immediate objectives of conquest, rather than a consistent adherence to a moral code. Chivalry, when observed, was often reserved for noble combatants and had limited application to non-combatants, common women, or during the sack of a fallen city. Firstly, chivalry was a complex and often contradictory set of ideals primarily developed by and for the knightly class. Its application was highly selective. It generally prescribed honorable conduct towards fellow knights, particularly those of similar social standing. Its tenets often did not extend to common soldiers, peasants, or even common women. The concept of chivalry as a protective shield for all women is largely a romanticized construct. During a siege, if a castle or town resisted fiercely, and then was eventually taken by storm, the rules of war often allowed for a period of indiscriminate violence and plunder, often referred to as the sack. In such situations, women, regardless of status, were highly vulnerable. Chroniclers frequently recount widespread slaughter, pillaging, and sexual violence during these events. The very act of taking a city by storm after a long and costly siege often led to a breakdown of discipline, and any chivalric ideals were quickly abandoned. The anger and exhaustion of the attacking army, combined with the desire for spoils, frequently overrode any moral constraints. For instance, during the sack of Magdeburg in 1631, a later example, but illustrative of the continued brutality of sieges, despite it being the 30 Years' War, the sheer scale of the atrocity against men, women, and children alike demonstrated a complete disregard for any notion of protection. While this is outside the strict medieval period, it reflects the enduring capacity for extreme violence in sieges where chivalry proved a thin veneer. Even within the medieval period, accounts of cities like Limoges 1370 or Béziers 1209 being sacked during the Albigensian Crusade describe horrific violence against all inhabitants, with little or no evidence of chivalry protecting women. Jean Froissart's account of the Black Prince's sack of Limoges, while possibly exaggerated, details slaughter of men, women, and children, indicating no special protection for women. Secondly, even when a city surrendered on terms, the fate of women could still be harsh. They might be dispossessed, expelled, or taken as hostages, though perhaps with less immediate violence than during a sack. But this was a conditional mercy, not a guarantee of chivalric protection. The chivalric ideal rarely extended to providing food for a starved population or safe passage for all. Furthermore, the very objective of a siege was to starve or terrify the defenders into submission, including the women and children inside. The use of psychological warfare, including threats against women and children, was not uncommon. While some individual knights might have shown mercy or respect, it was far from a universal practice dictated by a code. The ideal and the real were often miles apart. The notion that chivalry always protected women during medieval sieges is a romanticized distortion. While individual acts of compassion or adherence to certain ideals may have occurred, the overwhelming evidence suggests that the brutal realities of siege warfare, particularly during a sack, often superseded any chivalric codes. Women, like all inhabitants of a besieged community, faced immense dangers, and their protection was far from guaranteed by the ideals of knighthood. Their survival often depended on their own resilience, the desperate defense efforts of the community, or the pragmatic decisions of the victors, rather than a consistent chivalric safeguard.